I remember the sound before anything else. Not the wind, not the waves, though both were screaming, but the timbers of the ship itself, groaning like some great beast dying slow beneath our feet. Lanterns swung wildly from iron hooks, casting frantic shadows across the deck as water crashed over the rails in sheets so heavy it felt like rain turned to stone. The storm had risen with unnatural speed. 1 hour earlier, the sea had been calm, dark, wide, endless, but calm. Then the sky broke open. A wall of wind hammered us broadside, tipping the ship hard enough that every man aboard stumbled. By the time we regained our footing, the sails were already tearing like cloth held to flame. "Reef the main! Reef it!" the captain shouted, voice nearly swallowed by the wind. But no one could reach the lines in time. Another blast hit us, harder, bending the mast until it shrieked. The canvas whipped once, twice, and then split apart in a violent rip that echoed across the open water. The ship lurched, bow plunging deep into a black wave. I grabbed a rope and held on as freezing water slammed into my chest. The world tilted sideways. Men tumbled across the deck, sliding into the rail. Someone screamed, a short, sharp sound, quickly lost to the storm. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the chaos in a harsh white flash. I saw it then, water pouring into the gun ports, barrels rolling free, the longboats snapping against their ropes like panicked animals. The sea was swallowing us. "Below! Pump the bilge! Secure the powder! Hold fast! Hold fast!" Voices blurred. Orders clashed. Fear thickened the air. The ship pitched again, steeper this time. My grip slipped. I slammed against the deck, breath punched out of me. Salt stung my eyes. Rain, if it was rain, hit like gravel. Another flash carved open the sky, and for a moment I saw nothing but the monstrous shape of a wave, rising taller than the mast. It fell on us with a force that felt like the world ending. The deck vanished under white water. The mast snapped with a crack like thunder. Men disappeared, some knocked overboard, some crushed beneath falling rigging. The ship rolled to one side, then lurched violently back the other way. I staggered toward the rail, reaching for anything to hold. A coil of rope whipped past my face. The sea roared hungrily below. Somewhere aft, the captain shouted again, but the wind shredded his words. I caught only one. "Abandon!" A new sound cut him off, the deep, wrenching crack of the hull splitting. That's when I knew we were finished. Water surged through the deck seams. The ship shuddered like a living thing in agony. Men scrambled for barrels, planks, anything that floated. I grabbed a broken spar just as another wave rolled us. My feet lost the deck. My hands lost the rail. And then I was in the ocean. The cold hit like a hammer. My breath vanished in an instant. Salt filled my mouth. The sea spun me end over end, dragging me into darkness so complete it felt like drowning inside a well. The wreck of the ship flickered above me in brief, ghostly flashes each time lightning tore the sky open. I kicked upward, lungs burning. My hand struck something solid, a floating timber. and I clung to it with every ounce of strength I had left. All around me, voices shouted and disappeared. Debris bobbed and sank. The ship slipped stern first beneath the waves, its lanterns glowing dimly as they vanished into black water. The storm swallowed it whole. For long minutes, maybe an hour, maybe more, the waves tossed me like driftwood. I clung to the spar, teeth chattering, arms numb. Lightning showed nothing but water in every direction. No men, no sails, no hope. Then, slowly, the storm began to loosen its grip. The waves shrank. The wind eased. Darkness softened into bruised grey. Through the haze of exhaustion, I saw the shape of something rising in the distance. A long black line against the storm-battered horizon. Land. Closer than I dared believe. The current carried me toward it. My limbs barely obeyed me, but I kicked anyway, guiding the spar forward. As dawn crept into the sky, the outline sharpened. An island, small, distant, silent, and along the beach, scattered like bones of great beasts. The dark, broken ribs of old shipwrecks rose out of the sand. Dozens of them, waiting, watching, like they'd been expecting me. I woke to the feeling of sand shifting beneath my cheek, warm from the rising sun. For a few moments, I didn't move, partly from exhaustion, partly because the world felt too quiet after the storm. Only the soft hiss of waves brushed the shore. No shouting men, no creaking timbers, no thunder. When I finally pushed myself upright, the sight before me emptied the breath from my chest. The beach was littered with shipwrecks. They stretched in both directions, splintered ribs of old hulls rising from the sand like the bones of giant sea creatures. Some were nearly buried, only a few blackened beams stabbing upward. Others lay tilted on their sides, still showing the shape of a bow or the curve of a keel. One had a broken mast standing at an angle, strips of canvas fluttering like torn flags. Not one wreck, not two, dozens, and none of them seemed recent. Different styles of ships, different woods, different ages. Some beams were grey and soft with rot. Others were still solid, only weathered by sun and salt. It looked as though the island had been eating ships for centuries. I staggered toward the nearest hull, legs trembling from cold and exhaustion. Its planks were warped and split, but deep grooves marked the wood, tally marks scratched by a desperate hand. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. A crew had survived long enough to count days, but not long enough to leave. I knelt beside the beam and brushed sand from it. The marks continued far along the wood, disappearing where the hull sank beneath the beach. A shiver crawled up my spine. I turned toward the water. The sea was calm now, as if nothing had happened. Waves lapped gently at the wrecks, carrying bits of rope and seaweed. A crate floated lazily near shore before grounding itself on the sand. Its lid hung open, empty. Farther down the beach, I saw other items. A rusted lantern, a hatchet head without its handle, broken barrels half full of sand, tangled piles of rope bleached white by the sun. Signs of life, but no life. I forced myself to walk. My boots left deep prints, in the soft sand, the only fresh marks on a beach full of ghosts. A little farther down, something else caught my eye. Faint footprints leading inland. More than one set, some small, some larger, some barefoot. They overlapped so heavily, it was impossible to count how many people had walked there, only that many had. Survivors from different wrecks at different times. But the prints didn't continue far. They vanished abruptly near the tree line, as though the forest had swallowed their trail. The vines and undergrowth looked undisturbed. No broken branches, no trampled brush. Either they'd chosen to disappear into the dense green, or they never made it far. A dryness in my throat forced me inland. After pushing through the first row of trees, the shade cooled the air instantly. The forest smelled alive. Wet earth, leaves, distant flowers. Somewhere inside, water trickled faintly. I followed the sound until I found a small stream winding over smooth stones. I cupped the water and drank, letting the cold spread through me. When my strength returned a little, I went back toward the beach, careful, quiet. From the shadow of the trees, the wrecks looked even stranger. Their tilted ribs cast long, thin shadows across the sand. Birds perched on some of them, but not many. The beach was quieter than any shoreline I'd known. And then I saw it. Near one of the larger hulls, a broad, low ship whose planks still held their shape. Smoke stains darkened the underside of the wood. A fire had been lit there recently, protected from wind and sun by the wreck's shadow. Not months ago, not years, days, maybe less. My heartbeat quickened. I stepped closer, brushing sand away from the stones arranged in a loose circle. A fire pit. Burnt wood crumbled under my touch. Someone had been alive here. Someone had sat in the shade of that wreck and watched the same empty sea I had been dragged across. But they were gone now. No footprints around the pit. No belongings. No sign of struggle. Just absence. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of the wrecks pressing in around me. The island wasn't empty because no one survived shipwrecks here. It was empty because no one stayed, or couldn't. A breeze shifted across the beach, stirring sand across the broken hulls. The sound was soft but strange, almost like whispering across old bones. I wasn't alone on this island. I knew that now. Someone had survived before me, and whatever they found here, it had taken them too. The farther I walked along the shoreline, the clearer it became that this island wasn't a place ships accidentally reached. It was where they ended up. Wrecks lay scattered like warning signs, each one different from the last. A cutter, narrow and sharp. A squat merchant hull. A longboat, bleached nearly white. All ruined, all silent. I stopped at a wreck that looked newer than the others. Its ribs still held shape, and faint blue paint clung to the wood. A brass plate half buried in sand caught my eye. I dug it free enough to read one word. Caroline. A name. A ship with a crew who had stood on this same beach at some point. Yet no trace of them remained. The stillness around me felt wrong. Beaches usually carried life. Crabs, gulls, anything. But this one felt abandoned in a way that went deeper than emptiness. Even the breeze seemed careful, lifting sand in slow, hesitant waves. I kept moving until the wrecks thinned and the sand began to slope toward a rocky outcrop. Dark stones jutted into the water, slick with algae. I climbed carefully, boots scraping. That's when I noticed deep parallel gouges carved across the rock. Sharp, intentional. Something heavy had been dragged here once. Ahead, the sand showed disturbed patches. I knelt, brushing them clear. 2 sets of footprints emerged. Bare feet, one pair smaller than the other. They moved inland, then abruptly shifted sideways, then doubled back toward the sea. The spacing between prints was wrong for walking, more like running, or being dragged. The tracks ended where the tide had washed the sand smooth. A cold prickle crept across my skin. I stood slowly and scanned the horizon. Broken planks and rope ends floated offshore, drifting lazily in the current. The sea gave pieces back every time it breathed, but never anything whole. Rounding the rocky bend, I froze. A full ship stood in the shallows, not shattered, not buried, whole. Its bow rested gently on the beach while the stern still floated, swaying with the tide. Seaweed draped the hull, but the wood itself was intact. A rope ladder hung over the side, its rungs aged but steady. Someone had been on that deck recently. I approached carefully. The air around the ship felt weighted, like a place holding a secret. Up close, the details sharpened. A torn sail, wrapped around the mast, a railing snapped cleanly, and a neat coil of rope beside a cleat. Too neat for a storm-tossed wreck. This ship hadn't been abandoned in chaos. It had been left. I tested the ladder. It groaned, but held. Slowly, I climbed, heart thudding. My head rose above the deck, and I froze halfway up. The deck was empty, but not untouched. Footprints dotted the boards, some clearer than others. A lantern sat beside the mast, soot fresh around the rim. Coiled rope lay arranged in a way that looked deliberate, not accidental. And near the bow, placed neatly side by side, were small white stones. 10 of them, smooth, rounded, all nearly identical, arranged in a straight line. Like someone had left them as a message, or a marker, or something worse, something repeated. I stepped onto the deck fully, scanning the shadows beneath railings and behind crates. Nothing moved, no voices, no sign of life. But someone had been here recently, very recently, and now they were gone. Whether they were hiding from me or from something else, I couldn't tell. But the island no longer felt empty. It felt aware, as if it had been watching me from the moment I washed ashore. The deck felt too quiet, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. I moved slowly, checking each corner, expecting at any moment to find someone crouched behind a crate or leaning over the rail. But the ship was empty, emptier than any vessel should be that had clearly seen recent use. Near the mast, a small crate had wedged itself into a beam. Its lid hung crooked. Inside lay a knife, clean, sharp, and absolutely not abandoned by accident. The blade looked recently honed. Thin scratch lines, still fresh along the metal. Someone had prepared to survive here. Someone who had every intention of returning. I scanned the deck again, feeling exposed. Next to the crate lay a damp linen shirt, torn at the sleeve, but in good condition. The stitching inside the collar hadn't faded yet. That meant it hadn't been lying in the salt air for long. I followed a set of footprints across the planks, some faint, some pressed deeply. They led toward the bow, straight to the strange line of small white stones I'd noticed earlier. 10 of them, placed with care, smooth, identical, forming a neat row. Behind them, half buried under a scrap of sailcloth, lay a thin leather ledger. I lifted it gently. Most pages were blurred by salt, but enough writing remained to read the progression. Shoreline full of wrecks. No bodies, only prints. They went inland. The next few lines grew shakier. They didn't return. Something here. The last entry was only 2 words. Not alone. A cold ripple crept through me. I flipped to the back and found one more set of marks. 10 tally lines, circled together. 10 tallies. 10 stones. A message I didn't yet understand. The breeze shifted then. Light, but with a crispness that made the tiny hairs on my arms rise. I turned toward the forest. At first glance, nothing moved. The shadows were still, the branches quiet. But I felt it. A change. A presence. I climbed down from the deck, boots sinking into the sand. The moment I stepped off the last rung, I sensed it again. Something watching from the tree line. Not approaching, not hiding, simply observing. I backed away from the ship, eyes fixed on the forest edge. The leaves rustled once. Not wind. Movement. I thought I caught a glimpse of something pale through the branches. Cloth. Skin. Eyes. Then it vanished. The beach remained empty. The only sound was the slow push of waves against half-buried wrecks. Yet the feeling wouldn't leave. I was no longer wandering an abandoned place. I was walking where others had walked, where others had disappeared, where someone still remained. The shipwrecks marked the bodies of long-dead vessels, but whatever had taken their crews was still on this island, and it knew I had arrived. I stayed on the beach longer than I should have, staring at the tree line, the way a man stares at a dark doorway he knows he'll eventually have to enter. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being watched clung to me like damp air. The forest didn't just look quiet. It looked alert. Better to keep moving than stand still like bait. I followed the shoreline, staying where the sand was firm enough to walk easily. The wrecks grew thinner for a stretch, then thickened again farther down, piling in chaotic silhouettes. Their ribs carved long shadows across the beach, dark slashes that stretched toward the waves. Near 2 collapsed hulls, I found footprints, far more than the scattered ones earlier. These were deeper, clearer, preserved by wind patterns. Bare feet and boots, large and small, heading inland. Dozens of them. A group, not a lone survivor. I crouched and traced one print. The edges were softened by time, but not erased. The tide hadn't reached this area recently. These tracks were older, but not ancient. They marched straight toward the forest and vanished the moment they crossed the first line of trees. Not a broken branch, not a pressed leaf, not a scuffed root. Gone, as if the forest swallowed every sign of movement. The thought tightened something in my chest. I backed away and continued down the beach. The sun rose higher, warming the sand. My clothes dried stiff from salt, but my mouth felt parched again. I needed more water soon. The stream I'd found earlier wasn't far, but I wasn't turning back yet. Not until I understood this place a little better. At a narrow bend in the shoreline, something stood upright in the sand. A wooden post, weathered, rough, but unmistakably placed there on purpose. It wasn't from a ship. It had been hammered into the ground, a marker or a warning. I approached carefully. Thin strips of cloth hung from the top, knotted and sun-bleached. The wood bore carvings, long scratches, shallow symbols, and letters nearly worn smooth. I brushed sand from the uppermost line. Stay. Just one word. Beneath it were tally marks, 10 of them. Then a carved circle around the group. The same pattern from the ledger on the ship. The same number of stones arranged on the deck. 10. Always 10. 10 what? Survivors, days, attempts, or 10 that never returned. I stepped back from the post. The beach around it was strangely clear, as if others had passed by often. The sand bore faint smudges, but no readable prints. Whatever this post meant, it wasn't random. I followed the beach another few minutes until I found a shallow fire pit. Stones arranged in a tight ring. The ashes inside were pale, scattered by wind, but the char had not yet been washed away by tide or rain. Someone had camped here recently. A survivor from another wreck. Or the same person who placed the stones. Inside the circle lay a small shell, not drifted there, placed. When I turned it over, faint scratches lined the inside. A repeating shape. Not letters, not numbers. Just a simple mark etched over and over, growing deeper each time. A symbol. A message I couldn't read. I set the shell back exactly as I found it. The wind blew lightly along the treetops. Leaves shivered, branches swaying in a slow, rhythmic pulse. It should have been soothing. It wasn't. Because this time, the rustling wasn't just wind. Something moved inside the forest. I turned sharply. Nothing visible. No figure. No animal. But the presence I'd felt since the ship had grown stronger, clearer, like eyes following from behind the cover of leaves. I stepped backward along the beach, refusing to turn my back on the trees. Every instinct told me the same thing. Someone lived here, or had lived here until very recently, and they were watching everything I did. But why hide? Why leave warnings carved in wood and stone? Why no return footprints from the forest? I looked along the beach, the endless graveyard of ships, the intact vessel, the post, the silent woods, and felt the truth settle in my bones like cold water. Men had washed up here for years. They had tried to survive. They had marked their warnings. But none had left the island. And whatever remained in that forest had been here long enough to learn patience. By midday, the heat pressed down on the sand so heavily that the shoreline shimmered. Standing exposed made me feel like a signal flag waving for whoever or whatever watched from the trees. Eventually, survival outweighed hesitation. I needed shelter, shade, and fresh water. The forest was the only place offering all three, but stepping toward it felt like stepping into the mouth of something. Still, I went. The moment I crossed from sand to dirt, the ground cooled beneath my boots. Shade covered me instantly. The canopy overhead stitched so tightly that only thin threads of light made it through. The air smelled of damp leaves and earth, a sharp contrast to the salt and sun outside. The forest didn't feel empty. It felt aware. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb branches or vines. Every sound I made seemed too loud. Snapped twigs, shifting soil, the rasp of my breath. Somewhere deeper in the trees, something answered with a soft rustle. Not close, but not far. Staying calm became an act of will. I followed the faintest natural path, a slight dip in the ground where water once flowed. Roots knotted across the earth, some thicker than my wrist. Ferns brushed my clothes. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, as if it carried the weight of everyone who had walked here before me. Minutes passed, maybe more. The beach disappeared behind layers of trees. I kept listening for footsteps, voices, anything human. Nothing came. Then the forest opened into a small clearing, and I stopped dead. There had once been a camp here. Rotted wooden frames slumped beneath vines. A half-collapsed lean-to leaned sideways, covered in moss so thick it resembled green fur. A fire ring sat in the centre, stones blackened with soot but long cold. Around it lay scattered remnants, cracked pottery, torn cloth, a rusted spoon, a broken shoe buckle. And near the fire pit, embedded in the soil, a single wooden pole stood upright, the same kind of warning marker I'd seen on the beach. This one bore no cloth strips, just deep carved lines, 10 tallies, circled once, always 10. I crouched and touched one of the carvings. The wood flaked slightly, old, but protected by shade. Whoever made this post had lived here for a while. Days, maybe weeks, maybe longer. But the camp was wrong in another way. There were no personal belongings, no sleeping rolls, no gear, no signs of a struggle. It didn't look abandoned in a hurry. It looked cleared, as if whoever lived here had left willingly. Until you noticed the lack of footprints anywhere near the edge of the clearing, or the fact that the vines growing over the camp looked disturbed, not by weather, but by hands moving through them recently. A twisting unease crept up my spine. I stood slowly and surveyed the trees. A faint trail, barely visible, led out the other side of the clearing. The ground there looked slightly more packed, leaves brushed aside. Someone had passed through this path more recently than the rest of the camp suggested. I followed, stepping lightly. After several minutes, I reached another open patch, a ridge overlooking the interior of the island. From here, I could see a narrow valley, thick with undergrowth, cutting straight into the island's heart. The trees below swayed gently, their tops forming a dark green sea. But something else caught my eye. On the far side of the valley, woven into the trees, smoke, thin, pale, distant, a fire, not old, not forgotten. Someone was alive on this island, someone who knew how to avoid detection, someone who might have been following me since I arrived. Relief hit first, human life, a possible ally, answers. Then a second thought followed, colder and far more sobering. If they wanted help, why hadn't they revealed themselves by now? The smoke rose in a thin column, barely visible. Whoever lit that fire didn't want attention. Not from me. Not from anything else. I stayed crouched behind a fallen log and watched the distant smoke twist upward. The forest felt completely still around me, as if the island held its breath again, waiting for what I would do. Go to the smoke, return to the beach, follow the hidden trail deeper. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as the breeze shifted, carrying the scent of burning wood, faint but unmistakable. The island was not abandoned, not forgotten, and not empty. Someone had survived the ship graveyard, but whether they were friend or threat. The thin column of smoke in the distance pulled me forward like a rope around the chest. It rose just enough to be seen through gaps in the canopy, then disappeared again behind branches. Whoever made that fire hadn't wanted it seen, yet it still reached me. I descended the ridge slowly, choosing each step, careful not to snap branches. The deeper I went, the more the forest pressed in. The trunks grew thicker, the ground cooler. Every sound I made felt too loud, and every silence felt deliberate. After several minutes, I found something I didn't expect. A faint path. Not natural, not wide, but worn enough that someone had used it repeatedly. The undergrowth bowed subtly where feet had brushed past. Leaves lay flattened in a narrow line. I followed it. The smell of faint smoke drifted between the trees. Not strong enough to be from a roaring fire. This was the trace of one that had burned low, carefully tended, then smothered. The path dipped beneath a leaning tree, then curved around a fallen trunk. There, in a patch of soft earth, I found a footprint. Fresh, barefoot, edges sharp, heel deep. Someone had walked this trail recently, maybe hours ago. I crouched, studying the print. It was wide, strong, belonging to an adult. The ground around it bore no other signs of disturbance. Whoever left it knew how to move through the forest without leaving much behind. I kept moving. The trees thinned slightly, letting in bands of sunlight. A line of ash dusted the ground, fine grey flecks that didn't belong among the leaves. Someone had brushed ash off themselves or carried the remains of a fire along this very route. The trail narrowed as it approached a cluster of boulders pressed against a hillside. At first, I thought they formed a natural wall, but as I stepped closer, I saw an opening. Narrow, hidden by vines, almost invisible unless you stood directly in front of it. A shelter, a place someone had used deliberately. I crouched and listened. No breathing, no movement, just the forest's slow pulse. I eased forward and peeked inside. The shelter was small, barely enough room for one person to lie down. The floor was layered with old palm fronds, dried and flattened. In one corner lay a clay bowl, its rim darkened with soot. Beside it, a coil of rope rested neatly, frayed, but still usable. And near the back, half covered by a woven mat, I found a wooden cup, smooth, hand-carved, still faintly damp. Someone had drunk from it recently. My pulse hammered as I examined the shelter walls. Scratched into the stone and wood were symbols, tallies, 10 of them, circled once. The same pattern I'd seen on the ship, in the ledger, and carved into the warning post on the beach. 10. Always 10. But what did they mean? Before I could think further, a faint crack sounded outside the shelter, a twig breaking under weight. I froze. Another sound followed, softer, like brush moving. I edged out of the shelter and scanned the trees. Nothing visible, no figure. But the air had changed, the way it does when someone steps into your space but remains unseen. I waited. Silence, the kind that listens back. Then, just beyond a cluster of ferns, something shifted. Not wind, movement. Leaves parted slightly. I couldn't see a face, but I felt the presence clearly now. Someone stood there, hidden, measuring the distance between us. Friend, threat, something in between. I didn't call out. My instincts insisted on quiet. I stepped backward onto the path, giving the unseen watcher space. The forest accepted the movement, swallowing the shelter behind me. As I retreated down the trail, the rustling faded. Whoever was there didn't follow, but they didn't leave either. They had watched me enter the shelter, watched me find their cup, watched me understand that someone else lived on this island, someone patient, someone practiced, someone who now knew I was following their trail. When the forest finally closed behind me and the smoke disappeared from view, one truth settled cold and heavy in my chest. The island wasn't just home to a survivor. It was home to someone who didn't want to be found. I made my way back toward the western side of the island, choosing a different route from the one I'd taken in. The watcher, whoever they were, hadn't followed outright, but the forest felt too aware of my presence now. Every rustle, every sway of a branch felt connected to something just out of view. Better to keep moving. Better to stay in open light where nothing could ambush me from the shadows. When I finally stepped out of the trees, the sudden brightness of the beach forced me to squint. The wrecks looked different under the afternoon sun. More skeletal, more sharpened. Each tilted hull cast long, ragged shadows across the sand, and the tide curled gently at their bases like a patient animal. I walked toward the water, letting the wind cool my face. The sky had darkened with approaching clouds, low and grey. A storm building, smaller than the one that wrecked my ship, but still threatening. I didn't want to be caught in the forest if it broke. I followed the curve of the shoreline. The intact ship sat where I'd left it, bow angled into the sand, its rope ladder hanging limp. The row of white stones on its deck glowed faintly in the light. 10 perfect pieces. I kept walking. Farther down, past a cluster of jutting beams, I noticed something new, a shape in the sand that hadn't been there earlier, or if it had, I'd missed it completely. A circle, perfectly drawn, wide, smooth-edged. At first I thought it might be natural, drift from the tide or a wind pattern. But as I stepped closer, the shape sharpened into intention. The sand inside the circle had been flattened by hand, not by weather, and near the edge lay a small pile of shells, white, smooth, identical to the ones used in the stones on the ship. 10 of them, always 10. My stomach tightened. I knelt and touched the sand, still firm, still cool. The circle was recent, very recent. Someone had made this today. I rose and scanned the entire stretch of beach. The air was silent, save for the hiss of the incoming tide. The wrecks loomed like broken monuments. If the watcher had made the circle, they had done it after tracking me from the shelter. A message? A boundary? A warning? Or was it meant to guide me? I looked closer. Something faint was etched inside the flattened sand. At first, it was too light to see. I brushed away a thin layer, revealing a shape, simple, shallow, scratched with a stone, a line of tallies, 10 again, all crossed through with a deeper slash. 10, crossed out. My breath snagged. If 10 meant a number, days, people, attempts, the slash meant the cycle had ended. A failure, a death, a warning not to expect more chances. Wind lifted sand and stretched small rivulets across the circle, already trying to erase it. Whatever the message meant, it wasn't meant to last long. I stepped back and froze. Footprints, fresh ones. A set of barefoot prints curved around the circle, leading away from it. The toes pointed outward, not inward, meaning the person who made it had left immediately after finishing. The steps were light but quick, heading toward the tree line to the north. I followed them a few yards until the prints reached firmer sand, and then vanished again into the undergrowth. Whoever this person was, they'd been watching me closely enough, and long enough, to know exactly where I would walk. They had walked ahead of me deliberately, placing the circle where I would find it. And they'd wanted me to understand it. But why? Why warn me? Why not simply appear? The sky darkened further. A rumble of distant thunder rolled across the horizon. Not violent, but enough to promise rain. I needed shelter. I turned toward the forest again, scanning the edge for any sign of movement. Then I noticed something else. Subtle, but unmistakable. The fire smoke was gone. The thin ribbon that had risen from the interior earlier had disappeared entirely. Either the fire had burned out, or it had been put out deliberately. Someone knew I was coming. I stepped back from the trees, heart thrumming. The wind carried another rumble of thunder, and for a moment, the island felt like it held its breath again, waiting to see what I would choose. Stay on the open beach with the wrecks? Head back into the dark forest toward the hidden watcher? Return to the ridge and search for the valley trail? Or go back to the intact ship and wait? None of the choices felt safe. The only thing I knew for certain was this. The island was changing its rhythm around me. The Watcher was no longer avoiding me. They were directing me, and I was running out of time before the next storm hit. The sky darkened until the whole island felt wrapped in a dull grey blanket. A storm was building again, not like the one that wrecked my ship, but strong enough that I didn't want to be caught in the open. The forest still felt too dangerous, so I headed toward the largest cluster of wrecks, hoping the broken hulls would offer shelter. The tide pushed steadily in as I walked. Foam curled around the ribs of old ships, slapping gently at their sides as if greeting each one. I found the biggest wreck near the centre of the beach, its towering ribs rising like the remains of a long-dead cathedral. The shadow beneath it was wide, dry, and cool. A temporary shelter, better than the trees. I ducked beneath an angled beam. The moment I stepped inside, the wind softened. The roar of the beach dimmed. It was almost peaceful until I noticed the sand beneath my feet. A trail. A long, thin line where sand had been pushed aside by someone walking through recently. Not a full set of footprints. Just the faint shift that happens when someone knows how to move quietly. The Watcher had been here. I followed the trail deeper under the hull, passing fallen beams and half-collapsed ribs. The structure opened into a long corridor carved naturally by rot and storms. Light filtered through gaps in the wood, casting stripes across the wet sand. In those stripes, I found more signs. A scuff on a timber. Bits of ash, and a knot of rope tied deliberately around a fallen rib. Someone used this wreck like a hallway. When I reached the far end, the tide washed softly through the opening. I crawled out the narrow gap and stopped. A single footprint waited in the damp sand outside. Bare, deep, fresh, pointed directly toward the wreck. The Watcher had come to look for me, or to see if I would follow them. Lightning flickered across the clouds, followed by a distant roll of thunder. Rain began to fall in scattered drops. I retreated back under the hull as the storm grew heavier. Water hammered the wood overhead, echoing through the bones of the ship. Then I heard it. Knock, knock. Pause. Knock. Not wind, not water. Something, or someone, tapping wood from deeper inside. I turned slowly. The sound didn't repeat, but it didn't need to. I followed the echo until I reached the rib with the rope knot. Behind it, tucked between two beams, was a small canvas-wrapped bundle. I pulled it free and unrolled it carefully. Inside were three things: a short wooden stake, a length of cord, and a single smooth white stone. One stone, not 10. Another message, another pattern I didn't understand. The storm cracked overhead, rattling the wreck. Rain poured in thin lines through the holes above, dripping onto the sand in uneven rhythms. I backed away from the tide, deeper into the wreck, until something caught my eye. A plank in the hull, smoother than the others, carved more recently, out of place. I brushed sand from its base. The plank shifted slightly. Not a wall, not a beam, a door, hidden behind the fallen ribs of the ship. I pressed my hand against it. It moved a little, just enough to show it could open if pulled. Beyond it, Faint air drifted out, cool, dry, carrying a smell of old wood and something metallic. The Watcher wasn't just moving between the wrecks. They had built places beneath them, tunnels, hiding spaces, shelters no storm could reach. Thunder cracked again, closer now. Rain hammered the ship. Wind cut sideways through the wreck's ribs, cold and sharp. I stared at the narrow seam of the hidden door. If I opened it, I would be stepping into the Watcher's world, their territory, their refuge. But if I stayed outside, the storm and the island would finish what the sea started. I placed my fingers in the gap and pulled. The plank slid inward with more ease than I expected. A gust of cool, stale air brushed my face. Earthy, faintly metallic, carrying the scent of stone sealed away from sunlight. I slipped inside and lowered the plank behind me, letting the storm outside fade to a distant roar. The darkness was nearly complete, broken only by thin slivers of light forcing their way through cracks in the wreck above. I waited for my eyes to adjust, one hand steady against the wall. The ground beneath me was firm, dry, packed dirt, not sand, a tunnel, hidden beneath the ship, built by hands that had worked with patience. As the shapes sharpened, I followed the narrow passage downward. Wooden supports braced the walls, old beams taken from the wreck itself. The deeper I went, the cooler the air became, until the only sound was the drip of water somewhere in the distance. Then the tunnel opened into a chamber. I froze. The room was small, but tall enough to stand in. Candles, burnt down to stubs, lined a shelf carved into the wall. A thin blanket lay folded in a corner. A clay jar sat beside it, half filled with water. And on the far side of the chamber, arranged with almost ritual care, were more stones. 10 again. Always 10. But this time, they formed a circle around something else. A small wooden carving. A figure. A man holding a spear, carved in primitive strokes. A guardian? A warning? A memory left behind? Before I could make sense of it, a sound echoed through the tunnel entrance. A footstep. Light, hesitant. My breath caught. I turned slowly. A figure stood in the passage, barefoot, thin, clothes tattered and sun-bleached. A man, older than me but hardened by years of surviving alone. His hair hung in tangled ropes down his shoulders. His skin was pale beneath layers of dirt and salt. His eyes, though, they were sharp, alert, watching everything. He didn't speak at first. He simply studied me, as if trying to determine whether I was real or another hallucination brought on by hunger and solitude. "You shouldn't have come," he finally whispered. His voice was hoarse from disuse. I swallowed hard. I didn't have much choice. He stepped further into the chamber, keeping his distance. His posture wasn't aggressive, just cautious. Behind his wary eyes sat an exhaustion so deep, it looked carved into his bones. "How long have you been here?" I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged weakly. "Longer than I can count. Long enough to know what this place does." I glanced at the stones, the carving, the marks. 10. Everywhere. What does it mean? He ran a hand through his tangled hair. The island takes 10. Every group that washes up. 10 days maybe. 10 people sometimes. 10 attempts to escape. It changes. But 10 is the pattern. The warning. My skin prickled. What happens after 10? He looked down at the stones. They disappear. One by one. Into the forest usually. No sign of struggle. No trail. No return. A quiet dread settled over me. And you? He exhaled shakily. I hid. Learned the paths. Learned how to move so the island wouldn't notice me. The forest is alive with dangers you can't see. But if you stay quiet, careful, unseen, you survive, I finished. He nodded faintly. For a while. Outside, thunder cracked. Rain hammered the ship, reverberating above us like a drum. The man stepped closer, studying my soaked clothes. You came from the storm, he murmured. The sea is still feeding this place. I motioned toward the tunnel. Come with me. We can signal a ship, build something, try to leave. His expression twisted. Fear or sorrow, I couldn't tell. I've seen too many try. The island doesn't let go. But you. His gaze sharpened. You should run. Before the 10 days are done. Before the forest realizes you're still here. How long has it been? I whispered. He didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. Another thunderclap shook the chamber. The man flinched, glanced toward the tunnel, then pressed a single stone into my hand. A smooth white piece identical to the others. Keep this, he said. It means you're still counted. Counted by what? His eyes darkened. By whatever keeps this place a graveyard. Before I could ask more, he slipped past me, moving with practiced silence. He climbed the tunnel like a shadow, vanishing toward another exit I hadn't noticed. Within seconds, he was gone. I stood alone in the chamber, the stone cold in my palm. The storm raged outside. The forest waited. And somewhere on this island, the last survivor had disappeared back into the shadows that kept him alive. But I wasn't him. I wasn't hidden. And my 10 days had already started.